Everybody, I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Manchester City versus Wolves in the English Premier League, and we'll get right into it. It's made using Keyframe. The link will be in the description, but Manchester City lined up a little bit differently in their asymmetric back four. Rodri was the lone pivot this time, and Cancelo spent most of his time in the wide area, especially in the first half, rather than the more frequent role we've seen him alongside Rodri as a double pivot or between the lines. But with the introduction of Kevin De Bruyne back into the side, there was much more variability. So the interchanging of the positions between these two players is something to look forward in the coming games on what to look for. But also against the Wolves, against their 5-4-1, Semedo jumps into the midfield as a right-side midfielder, and then they go with their back five as well. And they leave Pedro Neto as the lone striker, which made it very hard for them to transition out of their low block in the defensive phase into a more attacking position and get a structured attack or even a structured offensive vertical transition going. And one of the reasons is because of the occupation of Manchester City in the Wolves' defensive line. So we see Sterling played quite narrow along with Gabriel Jesus, occupying two of the wide central defenders, preventing them from jumping into the space between the lines. And we have Mahrez and Bernardo Silva just occupying the wider half space and the wide area on this side closest to the bottom of the screen, and with, as we saw, De Bruyne and Cancelo occupying the higher position at the top of our screen. And oftentimes we would see a lot of movement with De Bruyne, and not only this, he would then come sometimes as a double pivot alongside Rodri to then pull out a midfielder, allowing Sterling or Gabriel Jesus to drop between the lines. Or we could see him move into the wider area and then allow Cancelo to occupy the space between the lines as a horizontal interchange. Now De Bruyne would be free because he'd be occupying the width, and typically Wolves maintain their center as their reference for their spatial control, and they conceded space in the wide areas most of the time. But let's keep moving forward with the video. So now moving up the field, we can see Laporte jumps forward with the ball, and one of the benefits of having the single pivot, as Manchester City did, it allowed Laporte and even Walker at times. We would see Walker jump forward alongside Cancelo to then put him in closer proximity to then counterpress, as well as still maintaining access because of his physical attributes and his speed to then help out with Neto and Diaz, who's the deepest man back for the Manchester City team. But from here, with Laporte moving forward, he then would often create this Rondo situation with Cancelo in the wide area, De Bruyne and Sterling, creating a four-man Rondo box, and as with entry points into the lines between Wolves' defensive setup, we see now as the ball's further up the field, Bernardo Silva then comes more narrow between the lines to take advantage of the Wolves players. Now we can see this in reference to the Wolves shape. Semedo is a bit deeper for a wide midfielder. He's actually with the midfield line. This is Semedo here, so he's more of a midfielder, but in the defensive block, he often tracked Cancelo, and it left with just three midfielders, and now the space between the lines being occupied, and now oftentimes would result in a switch to Mahrez and taking advantage of this qualitative superiority. But one thing to note is the movement from De Bruyne again. De Bruyne's movement in behind, stretching the defensive line, elicited a deeper movement from Sterling to then try and get on the ball between the lines and create an avenue to then progress or get in behind via Cancelo. But with De Bruyne's movement, not only does he pushes the defensive line back, he also narrows the two defenders, the wing back and the central defender, which allows Cancelo to move higher and forces Semedo to drop deeper. So decreasing the number of players in the Wolves midfield line, thus allowing these defenders to jump more easily and more effectively. So now, looking at the build-up shape again from Manchester City, we have our three-man back line. We can't see Diaz in this picture, but he's just off the screen. We have Rodri as the lone pivot again, with the tendency now for Laporte with his left foot to drive forward through the half space, as well as Walker, as we see slightly higher here already. And now we start to see the dynamics of De Bruyne, Sterling, Jesus, and Bernardo Silva occupying the space between the lines. And this is a bit different from Manchester City, as in past games they've gone with a 2-3 structure between the lines, but now they go even more drastic as almost a 1-4, trying to create these lanes to progress through the defensive block, especially when Wolves is slightly stretched higher. So from here, with Laporte having the ball, he would be able then to drive forward. And as we see the connections through the single pivot, when Laporte drives forward with the ball, this would then create the situation, as we talked about earlier, between the Rondo structure and with Sterling remaining high between the lines. He's always an option for a third line pass, and then with De Bruyne as the recipient to the layoff after the third line pass, initiating the third man movement. But this was most effective when Wolves were more stretched in a higher or mid block. So Pedro Neto's on this side, so he joins the midfield, and Adama Traore is now the lone striker, which is, this is just situational, as when they transitioned offensively, sometimes players got displaced. But the positioning that's most important for City, I would say, was Sterling and Gabriel Jesus, because with these two players, their positioning in relation to the Wolves' central defenders, it prevented these players from Wolves, the wide center defenders, to jump out, because now they're effectively pinned by these two players, thus creating more space between the lines for players like Bernardo Silva, Kevin De Bruyne, and Cancelo when him and De Bruyne interchanged positions. So just with that in mind, let's keep moving with the video. Again, with the start of the build-up, we have our asymmetric back four, and now it's really well shown with Cancelo wider. And City's use of the asymmetry also was shown through their occupation in the wider areas. So on this side, we see Cancelo as the lone wide player, and on the weak side, it's either Bernardo Silva or Mahrez, depending on the situation. Mostly Mahrez, though, and Mahrez would occupy a much higher line, whereas on this side, Cancelo was much deeper. So this asymmetry also added another layer to the build-up of Manchester City, which we hadn't seen in multiple matches before this. But with the driving forward, we have our Rondo situation, and now what we see with this is, because the center back is driving forward, we now effectively have a 4 versus 2 situation, which would generally mean City would be able to work this situation and progress with players like Sterling, again, pinning the wide central defender, and now isolating this Rondo situation. But with the midfielders now, they'll have to make a decision if they overshift and go in to cover this 4 versus 2 situation with We call this a 4 versus 2 because there's only 2 active defenders within the sight of the ball. So if these players would overshift, that would then create the free man being Walker, who would then circulate, get the ball, and be able to dribble and progress through the weak side half space, and then take advantage of Mahrez and Bernardo Silva and that Rondo connection on the weak side. Now we can look at the interactions between De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva and how they differed in how they operated in the spaces that they did. So De Bruyne was very much in the half space. He often occupied the half space between 4 defenders, as we see here, and whereas Bernardo Silva oftentimes played in a much wider role in the wider half space or interior part of the wide corridor. And this made it easier for him and Mahrez to exchange positions and interchange their positions depending on the situation. It also gave them the opportunity to create double width to free up more movement between the lines, and as the ball would be progressed through the left half space via Laporte, and the midfield was drawn over by positioning himself wider. When Walker would get the ball and progress, then he would then more often than not be a free player to then further progress the ball. And now just showing some of the variability in City's build-up. When with one single pivot, it created the opportunity for a player in the first line of the build-up shape to then progress the ball himself and then create this double pivot via jumping rather than passing, which would then allow City to occupy these advanced roles with multiple players and create this positional superiority of passing options between the lines and between connections of defensive players, and allow Manchester City progressive passes as well as strong circulation to then progress and maintain possession as they go higher. And we see Cancelo now occupying the wide area higher up the field, mirroring the positioning of Mahrez on the right-hand side. So now the other big thing for Manchester City was their counter-pressing structure, and we see an option-oriented counter-press when they would lose the ball. So here they lose the ball, and now they have close proximity with multiple players, because the biggest thing for them is use the maximum amount of space but have their players be as close to each other as possible while still maintaining control of this space when in possession of the ball. So with these players, they're all roughly 12 to 15 yards apart, more than close enough to accurately press the ball once it was lost. So we'll see players jumping to behind them to cover this counter press in a good rest defense structure. So with players like Kyle Walker, he jumps to then address the ball, and Pedro Neto. And now we have Mahrez, Bernardo Silva back pressing, and players like Rodri, De Bruyne, and Gabriel Jesus just lurking behind them. But these players isolate the ball very quickly, and because of Wolves' lack of a higher outlet, possession was quite easily won back in the counter-pressing phase, and the ball was isolated quite easily because they were too much in their 5-4-1 block, and this didn't promote a fast transition very well going forward. So now the last picture, just the second half, wanted to show, it was more of the same, but I just wanted to show a counter-pressing structure and how this affected the match. So with these back three, we have João Cancelo just coming a little bit more narrow now, changing the dynamics of the pass, allowing Sterling to then move into the wide area which was much more of a rotation coming into the second half, putting Sterling a little bit wider, but also giving him the freedom to maintain central positioning. It freed up space for Gabriel Jesus and Kevin De Bruyne between the lines, and it made Wolves make more decisions defensively on whether their defenders were going to jump or whether they were going to hold their positions, especially the three central defenders. So with the defenders jumping to De Bruyne in this case, it would leave space in behind for players like Sterling to then run on and behind. But from here, especially in the second half, if we're talking counter-pressing and attacking versus the low block, we would see oftentimes both Laporte and Kyle Walker move a little bit higher and create this three-man positioning between themselves and Rodri, and then being able to then counter-press and null the transition from Wolves in through their midfield four. So that was the analysis. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Try to keep it short and sweet for you, and I'll see you in the next one.